Hi, everybody. This is Andrea from the Stigma-Free Society, president and co-founder. I just want to welcome you today to our Facebook Live event. I am very excited because we are discussing an issue that is very important and something that we have not touched upon as a society, really, and talking about anti-Asian racism and stigma with Alice today. So, how are you doing, Alice?
I'm great, thank you.
Nice. And for your last name, is it just T?
It's Tay.
Tay. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I got it right when I said your bio.
Thank you, thank
All
you.
right.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so I thought what would be a great way to start is to share Alice's bio. She's going to share with us today a little bit about her story and the work that she does in the realm of anti-Asian racism. A very important topic that has come to light, obviously, during COVID-19, but has always been, right, Alice, an issue that is very important and that people should talk about. And there needs to be activism in which you have really taken that on. So we're so honored to have you here today to talk about this important topic. So Alice Tay is currently the coordinator of equity and women's services at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. She has been an elementary educator and union activist for 30 years. That's pretty impressive. She has had the fortune and opportunity to work in many spaces of learning and has been engaged in the work of an anti-oppressive education, intersectional feminism, and equity-related how do you even say that word?
Pedagogical. I know it's a
That's
very
academic.
teachery word, I have to say.
Pedagogical approaches throughout her personal and professional life. Alice lives in Toronto with her partner and two children. So, welcome. So,
Thank you.
yeah, I just thought, why don't we casually just begin by you telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and the work you've done in regards, particularly into anti-Asian racism and stigma itself.
Okay. Andrea, first of all, I want to thank you and your organization for this opportunity. It is rare. It's rare to be talking about the specifics of anti-Asian racism, but it's also a rare opportunity. In the 30 years as a professional educator, if one can say, I've not had this opportunity to actually speak to my experiences and how my experiences inform my work and practice. So I want to thank you for this opportunity for sure.
Yeah.
So it is, as you said, a very interesting time. So what has happened in the pandemic, although not ahistorical in the sense that it's the first time it happens, somewhat in SARS, it's happened in the past, that there's a spike in anti-Asian racism when issues of crises come up in society, right? So right now, because of the history of where, like Trump, for example, spoke out about its alleged beginnings in China, it catapulted from there as an issue of racism that has spiked in the last year and a bit, right? That's kind of how it played out at the table. But what's interesting about anti Asian racism and not extraordinary is that it has a huge historical legacy and a colonial legacy in Canada. And I think that as horrible as the pandemic has been, the opportunity to bring this issue to the table has presented itself in unparalleled, I'm not going to use the word unprecedented,
Mhm.
unparalleled ways. Like it's the amount of voicing in social media and the solidarity work and allyship. I've never seen it this way in all my years as an educator and an activist, specifically with Asian communities and other communities. So that's kind of an entry. I do want to start by saying that I am speaking on behalf of myself and not for the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. I happen to be working as a staff member at this point there. So just want to make that clear. I think your other part of the question is a little bit about myself. So here we go. I am a teacher. I've been a teacher for over 30 years, elementary mainly, and I call myself a social justice educator. It's kind of what I call myself. All the work I've done has been particularly around building anti-oppression frameworks, right? I've been very, very fortunate. I have had opportunity in working at the education spaces with children, but I've also worked in pre-service programs such as York University and OISE, preparing teacher candidates for the life and career as a new educator, let's say. So what has been common with all my work, including the one I'm presently in with the union, is that much of my focus and my mindset is around anti oppression and social justice. So that's my work. Did you also want to hear a little bit about my sort of personal, like, journey?
Definitely. I'd love to know more about you, Alice, and
Okay.
also about your passions. And you engage in this very important work and what drives you, and a little about you would be wonderful.
Okay. So there's like four questions in that question you asked.
Yeah,
I
just
try.
free
Okay.
flow.
Okay. So a little personal information is I came over to Canada from the Philippines when I was 4 years old with my brother and my parents. 1969 is when during the decade of the first Prime Minister Trudeau, and this is relevant in that doors opened for Asian countries for immigration during the 60s, the late 60s, actually. So coming to Canada at that time is relevant to the story that we're going to be talking about in terms of addressing anti Asian racism, right? So my story is not unusual. I come from a working class family, first generation immigrant. My father worked as a caretaker most of his life, and this is also relevant as we kind of move forward in talking about my work and the work I've been involved in. My father was a hard worker, and my mother was both fiercely independent and intensely traditional. Let me leave it there. So that's kind of a little nutshell of my past. And where I came from, right?
Yeah.
So been living in Toronto for a long time, I guess since I was 5, so that would put me like over 50 years, right? So Toronto is my home, even though I'm connected to the Philippines and in a more ancestral way, China. But I've never set foot in China. So that's a little bit of myself.
Okay. So what drives your passion?
Okay, so what's interesting is it's a bit cliche, but I'm just going to put it out. Um, if one were to acknowledge that we have injustices in the world and believe that there is injustice in the world and that the spaces we're in are filled with experiences and barriers and lack of opportunities for certain groups of people, then one needs to make a decision, right? So, what drives my passion? One passion is that if I believe that there is this injustice, then what is my role? What is my work? And I think I'm not asking this of myself. I think everybody needs to ask this. If we live in an unjust society, then what is each of our roles in moving the society forward? So that's kind of a bit cliche, but it is what drives me. The second thing that drives me, and this is kind of more personal, is curiosity. The question I'm always asking is how to understand, how to know, and how to learn. And through that understanding and knowing and learning about the way the world works and the different experiences of people brings us to the question of actions, right? So kind of like a very big question. What's our passion or what's my
Yeah.
passion? But
Yeah.
that's kind of it, curiosity and a sense of, I don't want to use the word moral duty, but if
But
one
doing your
believes in
part
this,
maybe, right?
yeah, doing your part.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. And how's your lived experience personally impacted the work you do? Like, how is that related for you?
Okay. So I brought up in the beginning of our conversation that I grew up in a first generation immigrant home. Um, I was thinking about this, Andrea, like, because I saw the questions beforehand, and not to reveal too much of my own baggage. This is not a therapy session, right? Having said that, revealing enough so that one can make context of what I speak to in terms of the work we do now, right? So, um, mine is an ordinary childhood, ordinary life, in the sense that I believed what I experienced wasn't unusual, right? I had experienced physical and emotional violence as a child, and my life at home was not easy. And I think what is interesting is that it's layered with the home and school conflict, right? So, like many others, like there's trauma in lots of homes. The difference here is that the home and school conflict is laced with class difference, gender issues, as well as race issues. And that's kind of how things played out for me as a child. I'm going to give you three very quick stories and it'll make more sense,
That'd be
right?
perfect.
Yeah. So, and they're not the only stories, but they're important stories. They kind of mark who I am and reminds me of where I need to go. So, one story is this: I must be around 10 years old, and I'm standing in the line at McDonald's with my mother. And she and I are speaking Chinese because my mother was very adamant about keeping our home language. And a child behind me at about the same age, I must have been like around 10, I don't know, 12 maybe, talking to his parents, and he was a white child. And he turned around and he said, I don't understand why these people can't speak English. Just go back to their own country. So that was a marked moment for me. My mother, you could see it in her face, was livid, but we said nothing, nothing, right? So that was a moment. Another moment is my coming home. And what you have to understand, Andrea, is that being a young person in the suburban area of Toronto, there were sort of like scatterings of people of color at my school, but we were the minority. And being East Asian, there's always this tendency to be closest to whiteness, wanting to be closer to white and wanting to blend in. And so my mom, being intensely traditional, fought many things. She wanted us to keep our language. She wanted us to not be too white, not to go out too much, not to sleep over at people's houses, et cetera, et cetera. And I fought against that, right? So one day I came home and she reminded me, Alice, you are never going to be white. You will always have Asian eyes. You will always speak Chinese. So stop trying so hard, right? So that's another story.
Yeah.
And the third story I want to tell is walking through a big field to get to school. And I must have been younger. I was about 9. And there was a black child playing in the playground. And as I'm walking by him, I'm a couple of years older than him. He uses the word chink on me, right? And I remember as a young kid thinking, how is this happening? Right? How is he calling me that name when I'm sure he's experienced racism himself? Right? So this was another moment. But the reason why I'm kind of sharing these stories with you, Andrea, is because they continue to inform me in terms of how I position and the work that I do, whether
Hmm.
it's lateral violence, internal racism, or external racism in terms of anti-Asian racism and colonialism that we're facing. So, um, you asked me about my past experiences and stigma.
Yeah.
Those are a couple of stories.
Yeah. No, very powerful. Thanks for sharing that. Really
Um,
good.
I don't know. Did you want me to continue, or do you want to kind of pose another question?
Well, I was just wondering, how has this lived experience really impacted the work that you do? And so I know that you have these very powerful stories and experiences that were very traumatic, emotional, and obviously very significant. They have stuck with you, and so many others who experience such things. And I was just curious, like taking these learnings from when you were young and then as you grew up, how has that impacted the work that you do? And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, I think one of the aspects that I've come to understand is that lived experiences will only get us so far. We all have lived experience, but um, I'm one to think more sort of critically. I believe that we all have our own work, we all have our lived experience, but if we are stopping there, we're limited. So what does this mean? It means that we have to be more reflective and critical of how we think about our lived experience. And this is the work of, for example, reading, learning about other spaces, and also having conversations so that we can see where things intersect and things make sense in the larger picture, right? So I didn't quite answer your question, but I will get there. So when I was in my 20s, I got very involved in a women's movement in Toronto, in Canada. And this was very marked for me because what I learned in my 20s is that my experiences as a youngster was not an individualized stigma. It was actually systemic. What I experienced in terms of being Asian, first immigrant in Canada, coming from working class home, etc., there was a larger context to this conversation, right? And during the time I was in my 20s, this would have been like in 1980s, I guess, the women's movement was going through its own growing pain, right? So they were struggling for space in terms of queer identities, disabilities, racialized folks. And so all these identities and all these issues of intersectionality played out for me, right? And that's kind of where my journey of becoming much more critical, both as an activist, but as a person, kind of, I hate this expression, but I'm going to use it, kind of got woke, right?
Yeah.
Right. So when you say to me like what informs my work, those are kind of the beginnings, right? And
Mhm.
it kind of has traveled further into the spaces I've been, the people I've been with, the students I've worked with, the communities I've partnered with. We don't live in a vacuum. We are all socially constructed, which means every experience, whether through a book, whether through engagement with a group, informs the way we think and ultimately our actions, right?
Where did you go to school, Alice? I'm just curious.
Oh, it's so funny because when I was preparing for this interview, I said I wasn't going to name place or space, but I will tell you.
Okay.
No, 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 I'll tell you. I grew up, I went to high school at Stephen Leacock, which is in Scarborough, right? So that is, yeah. And it's funny because I'll meet people and they've been to Stephen Leacock. So
Yeah.
are you familiar with Toronto?
I am a little bit. I'm from Sudbury, Ontario originally.
Okay.
So, I'm up north. I was up north a little bit more, but yeah, my uncle's in Mississauga. So I do know a little bit.
So yeah, Mississauga is like opposite. Like Scarborough is East End, Mississauga is West End,
There
Toronto.
you go.
Yeah.
Nice. No, I have a political science women's studies degree
Yes.
actually. So I was identifying with a lot of what you were talking about with the intersectional feminism and the work that you do. So yeah, it brought me back a little. It's very interesting work and studies. So thanks for
Yes.
sharing that. So I was just curious, what role can educators play in reducing or eliminating anti-Asian stigma in their classrooms and with their students? What kinds of things can they do to take action?
So I think the first thing that educators need to come to the work of educating is that it's a very political act, right? There is no neutral being an educator. This means that every topic we converse with our students about, every book or resource we bring to the class is an act of intentionality, right? We pick books, we pick films, we pick school trips with purpose. And so none of this is apolitical, none of this is neutral, right? So I think that one aspect as educators is to pick stories pick topics, pick conversations that are going to engage students as opposed to have the curriculum engage students. The students are what needs to engage the curriculum, not the other way around, right? So it's not the curriculum that drives the learning, it's the students that drive the learning. And so this is going to be different depending on who you've got in front of you, right? So that's one aspect. I mean, there's this thing about the window and mirror analogy, right? Like schools are meant to have students be reflected in themselves. Like school and home should not be such a huge cultural conflict, right? Students should see themselves. But the other piece is also that it's an opportunity. It's probably the only opportunity in society where people come together and learn about what's not their reality. So there's that, both things have to happen, right? So whether it's talking about Asian communities or Black communities or Indigenous communities or LGBTQ communities or communities of disabilities, it's a space where students can see themselves, but also see what is not theirs, their reality, what is other people's realities,
Right.
right? And making sense of these intersectional spaces, but also these spaces that feel less personal or
Yeah.
feel more foreign to them, for lack
Right.
of a better word, right?
Yeah.
So I think the intentionality and the understanding that educators have a role and every decision they make matters, right? It matters. So that's a start.
What about some tools? Like as we have many teachers in our realm who use our student mental health
Mhm.
toolkit. Maybe what are some things Stigma-Free could include? What kind of tools can teachers use? Like I know you mentioned being mindful about books and resources and things, but is there anything you can think of that would be helpful?
Yeah, so there's a few things. I think that, especially when we're talking about communities that may or may not be represented in the space that we're in, it's really important for authenticity, right? So, like, utilize the students' families and communities, bring people in. And if the communities are not within the school community, reach out and invite people. Like, I'm not completely sold on representation, but I am. Like, representation matters and authenticity matters. And so, um, bringing the right voices to share stories that are diverse and not just of one for one kind of thing is really, really important, right? It's key to having authentic voices. It's key for people to feel that the space is inclusive and that it's their space. So these are all really important tools. I mean,
Mhm.
there's so many, Andrea, like, when people ask me what strategies, there's
Yeah.
so many strategies out there that you can just, I mean, the world of technology has us at our disposal
Yeah.
a million different links for the right books, right? A million different links for the right films, right?
Mhm.
Like, for example, the National Film Board pushes out like the most amazing educational resources to address racism, sexism, you name it. But more than just the strategies and more than just the tools is the approach that an educator comes to the work with, right? It's not just good enough to have good intentions. It's funny when you were reading my bio and you talked about the word pedagogical. So that's the difference between the right mind frame and just doing the work. Like
Mhm.
if an educator comes to the space with a critical openness, then the pedagogist shifts. It's no longer the teacher being the teacher. It's that the space becomes a learning space, and the
Mm.
teacher has much to learn from the communities, much to learn from the students, and there is reciprocity there. And that's less about strategies or the books. It is your approach, right? The approach of teaching should be an open stance for example. So that's kind of key. It's not
Yeah.
really a strategy, it's more like a framework, right?
Hmm. And a culture, right? Like
Yes,
cultivating that space and that environment. That's
yeah,
kind of
for
what I'm
sure.
hearing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, and also we talked about intersectional feminism and such in your bio, but I was really wondering about how other forms of stigma can intersect with anti-Asian stigma in your experience. So, how has that looked?
So, it's interesting when I was on your website and we were talking earlier about the work that Stigma-Free Society, your organization, does, and the specific focus on mental health. So, what is particularly provocative for me, and I've been listening to a number of speakers speak about this, is when we speak to mental health and we speak about it as an individual issue, it is void of understanding social determinants, right? Like, so yes, mental health and mental wellness is an issue that many people can experience for sure. And especially right now with the pandemic, I'm sure it's heightened, right? And the different layers around that. But when we begin to contextualize the conversation of mental health and layer it with race, gender, class, disabilities, and queerness, it becomes so much more complicated and so much more complex. And the layers of experience, both as individuals but also in systems, helps us to make sense of this idea of mental health as something bigger than ourselves. And that's important because the problem with the word stigma is that it sits in the self,
Yeah, it
right?
stands alone, right? And it
Right.
doesn't. Yeah,
No, we have
yeah.
to put it in the
That's how we. Yeah.
context of structures and systems. And the only way we can do that is to actually have conversations about it that is beyond the me, beyond the individual experience of mental
Mhm.
health and stigma, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that that's a really important way into this conversation and also to action, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What are the next steps? What's the call to action?
Right.
Yeah, it's one thing to learn and know and be knowledgeable, and of course, that is all wonderful too, but what are we gonna do about it, right? And so I appreciate
Yeah.
you taking that action and sharing all of this too, because it gives people a lot of insight, not only into your experience, but also into the importance of taking action themselves when they feel passionate about a subject. And so many of us are very passionate about stigma and mental health, but we bring our own experiences, whether it's we've experienced racism, like you said, or LGBTQ 2 plus. So yeah, it's you've brought up some really amazing points, and I think it'll give people a lot to think about.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing I was going to ask you about, how does activism and education weave together in your life? So when you approach it, and how does that work for you?
Um, it's such a hard thing to articulate because so much of what we personally interact and who we personally interact with collides with work, right? it
Mhm.
it ought to, not for everybody, but for me for sure, right?
Yeah.
So for example, my partner and my children are my biggest supporters.
Mhm.
My partner is a third generation Black maritimer, and our children are in their late teens now, and they're mixed race uh, people growing up in Canada. And so, when the reason why I say this is because, like, the work cannot be on your own, right? I purposefully surround myself with people that share similar values, can ally and be in solidarity with me. And this is in terms of my like family unit, but also my closest friends, right? Um, I wouldn't be able to do this work for myself or for anybody, my students, etc., or the members that I work with right now in the union, if I didn't have the strength and the values of the people that I'm surrounded with. And I know this sounds like um, kind of like sentimental, but it's really important. And this comes back to mental health, right?
Yeah.
It's really important to surround yourselves with people who you feel supported by, who you can learn from, and who can journey and struggle with you
Mm.
as part of the work, right?
I think that is so required, definitely, to have
Yes.
that support. And
And I
it's
think,
okay to be sentimental, Alice, you
oh,
know?
yeah, well, yeah, I try not to be. Right? I try not to be.
I noticed that.
Sometimes tears just get in the way. You know what I mean? They
Yeah,
just get in the way.
being human.
Yeah, a place for everything, Andrea.
Yes, I understand. Okay, so in my closing question, I was wondering, a lot of people talk about allyship, and can you define what allyship actually means first, and how can those of us who are working towards allyship support combating anti-Asian hate and stigma and racism? And I was wondering if you could just quickly touch on that. And
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So, so the thing about allyship is that there is work that we have to do on our own, and then there's work that we have to do beside somebody, and then there's work that we have to do behind somebody, and strategically, sometimes the work we have to do in front of somebody,
Mm,
right? So I think that's the key for allyship is that we are invested in our own learning, we are invested in our own actioning, and we are strategic in terms of who we are in our identities and our positionalities to move the work forward. So sometimes it means standing beside, and I'm meaning this metaphorically, of course, right? Standing beside, sometimes it's standing behind,
mhm.
right? And sometimes it's actually standing in front of,
Right.
right? Like, so there is no one rule of being a strong ally. There are strategies, and it's all about context. Where does it move the work forward, right? And which
Mm.
strategy is going to move the work forward?
Yeah.
And that's part of, not completely, part of the defining of allyship, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important for people to, understand that it's such an important, beyond just a concept, but a call to action. So
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. And that we have
Yeah.
to be strategic and
And I
intentional.
love that. It's like sometimes, when you're saying standing in front, I was imagining like advocacy on behalf of someone perhaps, or beside and with them and behind,
Yes.
encouraging them. So yeah, that's a really great metaphor. I
And
love that.
context is everything, right? You
Yes.
can't have the same rules in
No.
every single setting.
Yeah.
Context
Yeah.
is everything, and
There
so
has to be that flexibility.
different actions
Yeah.
for different situations if you want the best outcome.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Alice. This has been a very enlightening conversation for me. And I feel when we reached out to you about anti Asian racism, and thank you for coming on our show. We want to give, people who experience this issue a voice. And please send our way anybody who may want to do an inspiring story, or even yourself. We have a whole video series and so many things we would really like to be that ally. So at Stigma-Free, we're very grateful for your contribution today. And thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, Andrea, and this opportunity. You've been a lovely host. I appreciate it.
Okay, well,
And
stay
thank you.
on if you can
Continue
stay
on with your
on.
work. I will.
Oh, thank you. You can stay on, and then I'll thank you after we're done the live stream. So don't hang up on me. But I
Okay.
wanted to say, yeah, everybody have a beautiful day. We all have a strong part to play in this world in eliminating stigma and whatever that looks like in so many different ways. Take your own lived experience and be brave, be that ally, and know that we can make this world a better place. So thank you for doing that, Alice,
Well
and
said, Andrea. Thank you.
take care. All right, take care, everybody. Bye.